Something inside you has changed, and you may not have fully realized it yet. Certain things that once felt completely normal now start to bother you. Conversations that stay on the surface feel strangely exhausting. Places that used to feel familiar now carry a kind of heaviness that you can't easily explain. Nothing dramatic happened. Your life may look the same from the outside, but internally, something feels different. And here's the curious part. This shift often begins before a person even realizes that something inside them is transforming. It starts quietly, through small signals that are easy to ignore if you are not paying attention. But there is an important detail that almost no one explains. Some of these signs really do indicate growth. They can appear when your awareness begins to change and your perception starts moving beyond old patterns. Yet other signs can become traps that confuse the process and pull people in the wrong direction. So the real question becomes this: if you are feeling these changes, is your consciousness actually evolving, or is something inside your mind trying to resist that change? Because once you begin noticing certain signals, it may mean that something deeper in the way you see reality has already started to shift. At some point, something subtle begins to feel different in the background of your life. Nothing dramatic has happened. Your routine is still the same. The same streets, the same responsibilities, the same conversations. From the outside, everything appears normal, and yet, internally, something no longer fits the way it used to. You might notice it during moments that were once completely ordinary. Sitting in a familiar place, listening to a conversation you have heard many times before. Scrolling through the same type of information that used to capture your attention for hours. Suddenly there is a quiet sensation that is difficult to explain, a kind of emptiness in things that once felt engaging. It's not sadness exactly. It's not boredom in the traditional sense either. It feels more like your mind is watching everything from a slightly different angle. You begin to notice patterns that you never paid attention to before, the same topics repeating, the same ambitions circulating through conversations, the same cycles of worry, excitement, frustration, and distraction that seem to loop endlessly around daily life. And the strange part is that these patterns used to feel completely natural. You participated in them without questioning anything. Everyone around you did the same. That was simply how life worked. But now something inside you pauses. It observes. And that observation creates a small but undeniable discomfort. For example, imagine sitting in a group where everyone is talking about things that once interested you. Status, competition, possessions, appearances. In the past, you might have jumped right into the conversation. Your mind would have moved at the same rhythm as everyone else. Now, however, a quiet thought appears in the background. Is this really what all of this is about? That question does not arrive as a loud philosophical statement. It is softer than that, almost like a whisper that appears in between moments of attention. At first, many people misinterpret this feeling. They think something is wrong with them. They assume they are becoming unmotivated or disconnected from life. Some even worry that they are losing their drive or direction. But often the opposite is happening. Your mind is beginning to notice something it previously ignored. When perception changes, the old structures that once organized your sense of meaning start to feel thinner. The goals that once seemed unquestionable begin to lose some of their emotional weight. You might look at things you worked hard to achieve and feel a strange neutrality. Not rejection, not regret, just distance. This can be confusing because the world around you still moves according to the same expectations. Friends continue pursuing the same ambitions. Society continues rewarding the same milestones. And part of you wonders whether you should still feel the same excitement about those things. But another part of you is quietly asking a deeper question. What actually matters to me now? This inner shift rarely announces itself clearly. It usually appears as small moments of friction with the familiar. You might feel it while listening to conversations that circle around the same complaints, or when engaging in habits that once felt entertaining but now seem strangely empty. Even your own reactions start to look different. Situations that once triggered excitement or frustration may now produce a simple moment of observation instead. Almost like watching a familiar scene in a movie you've already seen many times, Your mind begins stepping slightly outside the automatic flow, and when that happens, the ordinary world can feel strangely flat. Not because life itself has lost meaning, but because the lens through which you were interpreting it is beginning to change. This stage is often uncomfortable precisely because it happens before clarity arrives. You are no longer fully satisfied with the old framework of meaning, but the new one has not yet revealed itself, so you exist in a subtle space between curiosity and uncertainty. During this period, many people try to force themselves back into the old rhythm. They assume the discomfort means they should simply push harder, distract themselves more, or return to the habits that once felt normal. Sometimes that works temporarily, but the quiet observation inside tends to return, because once the mind begins noticing patterns, it cannot completely unsee them. And this is where another interesting shift often begins to emerge. As your attention changes, you may start noticing something else that feels unfamiliar. It is not only activities that feel different, people do too. Conversations that once flowed effortlessly may start to feel strangely difficult to stay inside. Not because the people themselves have changed, but because the way you are listening has begun to shift. And this is often the moment when a person starts wondering something even more unsettling. Why do I suddenly feel a little disconnected from everyone around me? After that quiet discomfort with ordinary life begins to appear, another feeling often follows, one that can be even more confusing. It starts in small, almost invisible moments during interactions with other people. You may be sitting with friends, co-workers, or even family members, listening to a conversation that once felt completely natural. The voices, the laughter, the topics, everything looks the same from the outside. But inside something feels slightly different. Instead of being fully absorbed in the conversation, part of your mind seems to step back and observe. You start noticing how certain discussions move in circles. The same complaints appear again and again. The same reactions repeat themselves almost like a script that everyone unconsciously follows. Someone talks about work stress. Someone else responds with their own version of the same frustration. Another person adds a familiar story that you have heard before, and suddenly you realize you are not reacting in the same way you used to. You are listening, but you are also watching. It can feel as if the rhythm of the conversation is happening on one level, while your awareness is quietly sitting somewhere just outside of it. At first, this can create an uncomfortable thought. Why do I feel so distant right now? You may even try to push the feeling away. You jump back into the conversation, add a comment, laugh at the right moment. From the outside, everything still looks normal, but internally, there is a subtle sense that something has shifted. Topics that once captured your full attention now feel repetitive. The excitement that used to come naturally in certain social situations may feel weaker or even forced. It is not that you suddenly dislike the people around you. In fact, many people going through this phase care deeply about those in their lives. The change is not about rejection, it is about perception. Your mind is beginning to see patterns that were previously invisible, and when you start noticing patterns, something interesting happens. The automatic engagement that once fueled many conversations begins to fade. Instead of reacting instantly, you find yourself pausing more often. You listen longer before speaking. You observe how people respond emotionally to certain words or situations. You notice how quickly opinions form and how strongly people defend them. Sometimes you even catch yourself observing your own reactions in the same way. This shift can create a strange internal tension. Part of you still wants to participate the way you always have. There is comfort in that familiar rhythm. But another part of you has become more aware of the structure underneath those interactions. It's similar to watching a movie for the second time after already knowing the plot. The scenes still unfold the same way, but now you notice details you completely missed before. For some people, this experience can feel isolating. They begin to wonder if something is wrong with them. Why don't these conversations interest me the way they used to? Why do I feel slightly out of place even with people I've known for years? These questions can be unsettling, especially because nothing external has changed. The same relationships exist, the same environments remain, the same social dynamics continue. But internally, the lens through which you experience those dynamics is evolving. You might notice that you are less drawn to constant noise and more drawn to quiet moments of genuine connection. Instead of surface-level exchanges, you may find yourself craving conversations that feel more honest, more reflective, more real. Yet those kinds of conversations do not always happen easily in everyday life, and so there can be moments when you feel like you are standing slightly outside the social current that once carried you effortlessly. It is important to understand that this stage does not mean you are separating from people. What is actually happening is more subtle than that. Your awareness is beginning to slow down enough to observe the emotional patterns that shape human interaction. And when awareness slows down, automatic participation naturally changes. However, this is also where many people make a quiet but significant mistake. When someone begins noticing these differences in perception, it can be tempting to interpret them in the wrong way. The mind may start forming a subtle narrative, a story that says you have somehow outgrown others, or that you see something that they cannot see. This interpretation feels convincing because the experience itself is unfamiliar, but this is exactly where the process can become distorted. Because the moment awareness turns into comparison, the shift in perception begins to close instead of expand. And this leads to one of the most silent traps that appears during this stage of inner change. When a person begins to notice these changes in perception, something delicate happens inside the mind. At first, the shift feels like simple observation. You are seeing patterns more clearly. You are noticing reactions, habits, and conversations in a way that feels slightly more conscious than before. But the mind has a very old habit. Whenever it encounters something new or unfamiliar, it tries to organize that experience into a story. And one of the easiest stories it can create during this stage sounds something like this. Maybe I'm becoming more aware than the people around me. This thought rarely appears in a loud or arrogant way. In fact, it can be very quiet. Sometimes it even hides behind the idea of personal growth. You might begin to think that you are waking up while others are still asleep, that you are seeing through patterns that everyone else continues repeating. At first, this interpretation can feel comforting. It gives the strange feelings you have been experiencing a clear explanation. The discomfort with normal routines, the sense of distance in conversations, the awareness of repeating emotional patterns. It can all seem to fit neatly into one conclusion. You have changed and others simply haven't yet. But this is where a subtle trap appears. Because the moment awareness turns into comparison, something important begins to close. Real expansion of consciousness does not create a feeling of being above others. It actually does the opposite. It increases your ability to recognize that everyone is navigating their own patterns, their own fears, and their own levels of awareness at different moments in life. The moment the mind starts labeling people as less awake, a new pattern quietly replaces the old ones you were beginning to see. It becomes another form of separation. The strange irony is that the ego can easily disguise itself as awakening. Instead of seeking status through money, achievements, or appearance, it simply finds a new form of status through identity. Now the identity becomes the one who sees more, the one who understands more, the one who has awakened. But the deeper shift in consciousness is not about creating a new identity. It is about loosening the grip of identities altogether. When perception becomes clearer, something interesting happens. You start realizing that the same patterns you observe in others also exist within you. The same tendencies to react emotionally, the same moments of defensiveness, the same habits of thinking that repeat automatically. The difference is not that you have escaped those patterns. The difference is that you are beginning to see them, and that recognition naturally brings humility. Because once you truly observe the workings of the mind, it becomes very difficult to place yourself above anyone else. You begin to understand that everyone is operating from the level of awareness available to them in that moment, just as you have done many times in the past. This realization softens something inside. Instead of feeling separated from people, you start feeling a deeper sense of patience toward them. You notice their reactions, their fears, their frustrations, and instead of judging them, you recognize familiar human patterns. In many ways, it becomes easier to understand others once you stop trying to measure yourself against them. And this is a quiet sign that the process is moving in a healthy direction. because genuine expansion of awareness tends to create more curiosity, not more certainty, more listening, not more conclusions, more observation, not more labels. But there is another change that often appears once this shift in attitude begins to settle. You may start noticing that your sensitivity to environments becomes stronger. Places that once felt neutral suddenly feel overwhelming. Rooms filled with tension, noise, or emotional chaos can drain your energy much faster than before. It may take only a short time in certain environments before you feel mentally tired. At the same time, something else begins to feel surprisingly powerful. Simple spaces, quiet rooms, a walk outside, moments without constant stimulation, situations that once seemed ordinary may now bring a sense of mental clarity that is difficult to explain, and many people begin to wonder why these environments affect them so differently now. After the mind begins to soften its need to compare itself with others, another change often becomes noticeable. It does not appear as a dramatic realization, but as a shift in how your body and mind react to the spaces around you. Places start to feel different, not visually different. The same rooms, streets, offices, and social environments are still there. Nothing external has changed, yet the internal experience of being in those places begins to shift in a way that can be difficult to explain. You might walk into a crowded room and feel tired much faster than you used to. The noise, the tension in conversations, the restless movement of people checking their phones or speaking over one another suddenly feels overwhelming. Before, you might have stayed in that environment for hours without thinking about it. It was simply normal life. Now, after a short time, you feel a subtle pressure building inside your mind. Not anxiety exactly, but a kind of mental fatigue, as if your attention is being pulled in too many directions at once. You may leave that environment and immediately notice something interesting. The moment you step outside into fresh air or into a quieter place, your mind begins to settle again. Your breathing slows slightly, your thoughts feel less crowded, clarity begins to return. Many people assume this is purely emotional, or that they have simply become more sensitive in general. And in a way, that is partly true. But there is also something deeper happening with attention itself. When awareness begins to shift, the brain starts filtering information differently. Most of the time, the human mind is trained to ignore a large amount of sensory input. It focuses only on what seems necessary to navigate daily tasks. Conversations, screens, background noise, emotional signals from other people. All of this blends together into a kind of constant background hum. But as awareness grows, that automatic filtering begins to change. You start noticing subtle emotional tones in environments. The tension in a room during a disagreement, the restless energy of people who are distracted or stressed, the heaviness that sometimes exists in spaces where frustration or pressure has been building for long periods of time. You may not consciously analyze these signals, your body simply feels them, and this is where the experience becomes confusing for many people. They assume something is wrong with them, because they suddenly feel drained in places that never bothered them before. But often what is happening is that your perception has become more refined. Instead of moving unconsciously through environments, you are beginning to register the emotional and psychological atmosphere around you. Think of it like adjusting the sensitivity of a microphone. If the sensitivity is low, it captures only the loudest sounds. But when the sensitivity increases, it begins picking up subtler vibrations that were always present, but previously unnoticed. The same thing can happen with awareness. You begin sensing the rhythm of environments more clearly. This is also why simple places can start to feel surprisingly powerful. A quiet room with natural light, a slow walk through a park, the sound of wind moving through trees, even sitting alone for a few minutes without constant stimulation. These moments may begin to feel nourishing in a way they never did before. Not because they are extraordinary, but because the absence of noise allows your mind to reorganize itself. When the constant input of information slows down, something inside you recalibrates. Your thoughts begin spacing themselves out. The background tension you didn't even realize you were carrying starts dissolving little by little. This is why many people going through this stage suddenly feel drawn towards silence or nature. It is not an escape from life. It is a natural response to the way the mind processes stimulation when awareness becomes sharper. However, there is an important detail that often appears around this stage. As your sensitivity to environments increases, your mind may begin asking deeper questions about the structures that shape your life, the routines you follow, the beliefs you inherited, the definitions of success, purpose, and happiness that you accepted without much reflection. At some point, something inside you starts examining those ideas more carefully, not because someone told you to question them, but because your attention has become curious. And when curiosity awakens at this level, it rarely stops with environments or social dynamics. Soon the mind begins turning that same observation towards something even more fundamental. The assumptions you once believed were unquestionable. At a certain point, the shift in awareness begins moving deeper. It no longer appears only in how you feel in certain environments or conversations. Now it begins touching the structure of the ideas that once organized your life. Thoughts that used to feel solid start becoming flexible. Beliefs that once seemed obvious begin to feel less certain. This does not usually happen because someone convinced you to change your mind. In fact, it often occurs when you are alone, reflecting quietly, or noticing small inconsistencies in things you once accepted without question. A simple thought might appear, "Why do I believe this?" And the interesting part is that for the first time, your mind actually waits for an honest answer. Before this stage, most beliefs exist in the background. They guide decisions and reactions without ever being examined directly. Ideas about success, about what a meaningful life should look like, about how people are supposed to behave, about what happiness means. They are absorbed slowly over many years through culture, family, school, and social expectations. Most people carry these assumptions automatically. They move through life following them without much resistance because those beliefs were never placed under a microscope. But once awareness becomes more observant, that automatic acceptance begins to loosen. You might start noticing that certain goals you once pursued so intensely were never truly examined. They were simply inherited. Perhaps you were told that success means constant achievement, or that happiness is something you earn only after reaching certain milestones, or that stability must always come before curiosity. For a long time, these ideas may have guided your actions without friction, but now something inside you pauses. You begin asking quiet questions that once felt unnecessary. Is this actually true for me? What if the direction I've been following was never consciously chosen? These questions are not rebellious in nature. They are investigative. Your mind is no longer satisfied with borrowed certainty. Instead of accepting ideas simply because they are widely repeated, you begin observing how those ideas affect your experience of life. Do they bring clarity? Do they create pressure? Do they push you towards something meaningful, or do they simply keep you moving without reflection? This stage can feel both exciting and unsettling. Exciting because questioning opens space for deeper understanding. You begin to feel intellectually alive in a way that is different from simply collecting information. But it can also feel destabilizing, because when many beliefs start loosening at the same time, it can briefly feel like the ground underneath your thinking is shifting. Things that once seemed clear may now appear more complex. Ideas you defended strongly in the past may suddenly reveal hidden assumptions you never noticed before. Even the way you interpret your own identity may begin to evolve. You might catch yourself wondering how much of who you thought you were was actually shaped by expectation rather than conscious choice. And this realization can create a moment of internal silence, not confusion exactly, but openness. It is similar to walking into a room where the furniture has been rearranged. Nothing is missing, but the space suddenly feels unfamiliar. During this stage, some people try to quickly replace their old beliefs with new ones. The mind naturally wants stability, so it searches for fresh frameworks that promise certainty. But the deeper movement of awareness is not rushing toward new conclusions. It is learning to stay present with the questions. Instead of immediately filling the space with answers, you begin observing how your mind reacts to uncertainty itself. You notice the discomfort that appears when things are not clearly defined. You watch how quickly the brain tries to rebuild familiar structures, and simply noticing this process already changes something inside your relationship with thought. For the first time, you may realize that beliefs are not fixed truths living inside your mind. They are constructions, patterns that formed over time. And patterns can evolve when awareness is present. This stage of questioning does not mean rejecting everything you once believed. It simply means that your relationship with those beliefs becomes more conscious. You begin choosing what to keep and what to release with greater attention. And during this period of deeper reflection, something interesting sometimes happens in the middle of ordinary moments. You might be walking somewhere, sitting quietly, or simply observing the sky for a few seconds without distraction. Then, without warning, a brief moment of clarity appears. Not a complete answer, not a dramatic revelation, just a sudden sense that things make more sense than they did a moment before. After a period of questioning and reflection, something curious can begin to appear in the middle of very ordinary moments. It doesn't arrive with noise or intensity. In fact, it often happens when your mind is not actively searching for answers. You might be walking down a quiet street, sitting by a window looking at the sky for a few seconds while your thoughts slow down. Then suddenly something inside feels clear. Not clear in the sense that you have solved a problem or discovered a complicated explanation. It feels more like a brief alignment in the way your mind is seeing things. For a moment, the usual mental noise fades. The constant stream of analysis, worry, and internal dialogue becomes quiet enough for you to notice something else underneath. And what you notice is a simple feeling that things make sense in a broader way. It's difficult to describe because it doesn't arrive as a specific sentence in your mind. There is no voice explaining everything step by step. Instead, it feels like a moment of recognition, as if the pieces of your experience suddenly fit together for a second. During that moment, many of the questions that were moving through your mind lose their urgency, not because they were answered directly, but because they no longer feel as heavy. The need to force conclusions disappears. You simply observe. These moments are usually very brief. Sometimes they last only a few seconds before the normal activity of the mind returns. Your thoughts start moving again. Responsibilities come back into focus. The rhythm of daily life continues. But something about that short moment stays with you. It leaves a quiet impression that is difficult to ignore. Many people who experience this try to explain it in different ways. Some describe it as a moment of deep intuition. Others say it feels like stepping outside the constant pressure of thinking. Whatever the explanation may be, the experience tends to have one thing in common. It feels natural. There is no sense of effort involved. You didn't force your mind to reach that clarity. It appeared when your attention softened enough for it to emerge on its own. This is why these moments often happen during simple activities: walking without rushing, watching the movement of clouds, sitting quietly without a screen demanding your attention. In those situations, the brain is not overloaded with stimulation. The internal tension that usually drives constant thinking begins to loosen. And when that tension relaxes, the mind briefly reorganizes itself. Think of it like shaking a jar filled with water and sand. When the jar is constantly moving, everything inside remains cloudy. But when the movement stops, the particles slowly settle and the water becomes clear. Something similar can happen with awareness. When the mind stops pushing for answers, clarity sometimes appears on its own. These small moments may seem insignificant at first, but they often leave a subtle shift in how you see things afterward. You might return to your daily routine with the same responsibilities and the same environment, yet your reactions feel slightly different. Situations that once triggered immediate frustration may now create a pause instead. Certain worries may lose some of their intensity, not because your life suddenly became easier, but because your perspective has opened a little. The interesting part is that these moments of clarity rarely provide a final destination. They do not transform you instantly or erase every doubt. Instead, they act more like small signals that something inside your perception is reorganizing. Your mind is learning how to step outside its usual loops, even if only for a few seconds at a time. Over time, those seconds begin to matter, because each moment of clarity creates a small gap between you and the automatic patterns of thought you once followed without noticing. However, as this process continues, another strange feeling can begin to appear. You may notice that you no longer fully relate to the person you used to be. The motivations that once guided you feel slightly distant now. The old mental habits that shaped your decisions are no longer as convincing as they once were. But at the same time, the new version of yourself is not fully defined yet. You are not exactly who you were before, and you are not completely sure who you are becoming. For many people, this creates a quiet and unfamiliar sensation, almost as if they are standing between two different versions of themselves. After those moments of clarity begin appearing, a new sensation can quietly emerge. It is not dramatic, but it can feel strangely disorienting. You start noticing that the version of yourself who lived comfortably inside your old patterns no longer feels completely familiar. The goals that once motivated you with certainty now feel less solid. The reactions that used to happen automatically now pause for a moment before they unfold. Even the way you interpret your own experiences begins to shift. But at the same time, the new version of yourself is not fully clear yet. You have not stepped into a new identity with defined answers or a new direction that feels stable. Instead, you exist in a kind of space between the two. Part of you still recognizes the person you were. The habits, the routines, the ways of thinking that shaped your past are still present. They do not disappear overnight, yet another part of you has begun seeing those patterns from a different perspective. And once that perspective appears, it becomes difficult to return completely to the way things were. This is where many people experience a quiet, internal tension. You may move through your daily life, work, conversations, responsibilities, and everything continues functioning as it always has. From the outside, nothing seems different, but internally, it can feel as if you are walking between two different worlds. One world is familiar. It is built from the beliefs, motivations, and emotional patterns that guided you for years. You know how that world works. You know how to respond inside it. The other world is less defined. It is built from the new awareness that has been slowly growing inside you. The questions you have been asking, the moments of clarity you have experienced, the subtle distance you now feel from certain automatic behaviors. But this second world does not come with clear instructions. You cannot fully describe it yet, and that uncertainty can create a strange sensation, almost like standing on a bridge between two places. You can still see the land behind you, but the land ahead is partially covered in fog. During this phase, it is common to feel moments of doubt. Your mind may wonder if you are simply overthinking things. You might ask yourself whether it would be easier to return to the familiar rhythm you once followed without questioning. After all, there was a certain comfort in not examining everything so closely. Life moved faster when decisions were guided by automatic assumptions. But once awareness expands even slightly, something important changes. You cannot completely forget what you have started to notice. The patterns you observed, the beliefs you questioned, the brief moments of clarity that appeared in silence, all of these experiences leave a quiet imprint. Even if you try to ignore them for a while, they tend to return, not aggressively but persistently, like a gentle signal reminding you that something inside your perception has shifted. This is why the phase of being between two worlds often feels unstable. The old framework of meaning is no longer strong enough to fully guide you, but the new framework has not finished forming. So your mind moves back and forth between the two. Some days you may feel deeply reflective and aware of the subtle patterns shaping your thoughts and reactions. Other days, you may find yourself slipping back into familiar habits without even noticing. This movement is natural. Awareness does not grow in a straight line. It tends to expand through cycles of observation, reflection, and gradual integration. The important part is not forcing yourself to choose one world or the other too quickly. The space between them is actually where much of the real transformation takes place, because it is in this uncertain space that your mind learns something new. Instead of relying entirely on old beliefs or rushing toward new conclusions, you begin developing the ability to simply observe your experience as it unfolds. And this ability creates a deeper kind of stability than the one you had before. However, just as this new awareness begins settling, another reaction often appears. It comes from a part of the brain that is deeply connected to survival and familiarity. When the mind senses that its old structures are changing, it sometimes responds with a sudden wave of doubt. Questions may appear that feel surprisingly intense. You may catch yourself wondering if you are going too far with these reflections, if perhaps you are becoming strange, or if questioning your old patterns might somehow disrupt the stability of your life. These thoughts can feel convincing, because the brain naturally prefers what is predictable and known. And when real change begins to approach, that instinct often reacts in a very specific way. It introduces fear. Just when it seems like your awareness is beginning to settle into something deeper, another reaction often appears from within the mind. It doesn't feel like curiosity. It doesn't feel like clarity. It feels like doubt. Sometimes it arrives quietly, almost like a background whisper in your thoughts. Other times it appears suddenly, creating a strong wave of uncertainty that makes you question everything you have been experiencing. You might find yourself thinking things like, maybe I'm overanalyzing all of this, or what if I'm just making things more complicated than they need to be? These thoughts can feel surprisingly convincing. They carry a tone of caution, almost like your mind is trying to protect you from going too far into unfamiliar territory. And in a way, that is exactly what is happening. The human brain is designed to prefer what is predictable. Familiar routines, familiar beliefs, familiar emotional patterns, these structures create a sense of stability that the brain associates with safety. Even if those patterns are not always helpful, they are at least known. When awareness begins to shift, those structures start to loosen. The assumptions that once guided your decisions no longer feel automatic. The reactions that once happened instantly now pause long enough for you to observe them. From the perspective of deeper awareness, this is progress, but from the perspective of the brain's survival system, it can feel like instability. If the old patterns are no longer fully controlling your behavior, the mind may interpret that change as a kind of risk, and so it introduces a familiar response: fear. Not necessarily dramatic fear, but a subtle form of psychological resistance. It may appear as thoughts questioning whether you should continue exploring these changes in your perception. You might wonder if it would be easier to simply return to the way you used to see things. After all, the old patterns were predictable. You knew how to function within them. Your identity felt more clearly defined. Now things feel more open, and openness can sometimes feel uncomfortable. During this stage, many people experience an internal dialogue that moves back and forth. One part of the mind feels curious about the changes that have been happening. It recognizes the moments of clarity, the deeper observation of thoughts, the growing awareness of patterns. But another part of the mind becomes cautious. It asks questions like, where is all of this leading? Or, am I changing in ways that will make life harder? Sometimes the doubt even becomes personal. You may briefly wonder whether something is wrong with you for thinking so deeply about things that others seem to move through without hesitation. This is a very common reaction. When awareness expands, it naturally creates a small distance between you and the automatic flow of collective habits. You begin seeing patterns that most people are not actively examining. That difference can make you feel slightly out of sync with the environment around you. And the brain often interprets that difference as a signal to slow down or retreat. But here is the interesting part. The fear that appears at this stage is not necessarily a sign that something is wrong. In many cases, it appears precisely because something real is changing. Think about any major transition in life. Before stepping into something new, the mind usually passes through a moment of hesitation. It checks the surroundings, it evaluates the risk, it tries to predict what might happen next. That hesitation is part of the brain's natural design. The same mechanism that protects you from danger can also activate when your perception begins to shift beyond familiar boundaries. The challenge is that if fear becomes the dominant voice in this moment, many people retreat back into the comfort of their old patterns. They stop questioning, they stop observing, they convince themselves that it is better not to look too closely at the deeper structures shaping their experience. And slowly, the quiet awareness that had begun growing fades back into the background. But when someone moves through this moment of doubt without immediately shutting down their curiosity, something surprising begins to happen. The fear gradually loses its intensity. Not because it was defeated or pushed away, but because it was observed without being allowed to control every decision. And as this space between awareness and reaction grows stronger, another realization begins to form. You start to see that the most important changes in consciousness are not about discovering hidden secrets or gaining extraordinary knowledge. They happen in something much simpler, in the way you begin to experience ordinary moments of life. After moving through doubt and hesitation, a quieter realization often begins to settle in. It does not arrive with a dramatic insight or a sudden discovery about the universe. Instead, it grows slowly through small observations in everyday life. You start noticing that the real shift you have been experiencing is not happening outside of you. The world around you has not suddenly transformed. The same situations still appear. The same challenges still exist. People continue behaving in familiar ways, and life continues presenting its usual unpredictability. But your relationship with those situations begins to change. For example, imagine a moment that would have once triggered an immediate reaction. Perhaps someone says something critical. Maybe a plan does not go the way you expected. In the past, your mind might have reacted instantly, filling with frustration, defensiveness, or worry. The response would happen so quickly that you would barely notice the process. But now something different can occur. There is a small pause, not a forced pause, but a natural one. A brief space appears between what is happening and how your mind responds to it. Inside that space, you observe. You notice the first emotional impulse beginning to rise. You see the familiar pattern of thought that usually follows, but instead of being pulled immediately into that reaction, you are aware of it while it unfolds. This moment may last only a few seconds, yet it changes everything. Because when you can observe a reaction before fully becoming it, you gain a new kind of freedom. The situation itself has not changed. The external world is still presenting the same event. But your awareness of the internal process creates room for a different response. Sometimes that response is simply choosing not to react in the same automatic way. Other times, it means responding with more clarity rather than emotional momentum. This is why the deeper transformation of consciousness rarely looks dramatic from the outside. There are no obvious signals announcing that something profound has happened. You are still living your life, interacting with people, making decisions, and facing challenges. But internally, the structure of your experience has shifted. Instead of being completely absorbed in the stream of thoughts and emotions, you are beginning to see them as processes that move through your awareness. You notice how quickly the mind tries to interpret situations. You see how certain thoughts repeat themselves in familiar loops. You recognize the emotional habits that once seemed inseparable from who you are. And little by little, that recognition changes how strongly those patterns control your behavior. This does not mean the mind suddenly becomes silent or that emotions disappear. Thoughts still appear. Feelings still move through you, but they are no longer the unquestioned authority guiding every moment. Instead, they become signals that you can observe, understand, and respond to with more intention. Many people expect that expanding consciousness will reveal hidden truths about reality or unlock extraordinary knowledge. But in practice, the most meaningful change is often far simpler. You become more aware of how your own mind constructs your experience of the world. You begin seeing how much of your suffering came not from the events themselves, but from the automatic interpretations that followed them. And once you see those interpretations forming in real time, they start losing some of their power. A comment from another person may still trigger emotion, but it does not dominate your entire mental space the way it once did. A stressful situation may still require action, but it does not immediately spiral into endless worry. Instead of being carried away by every wave of thought, you begin learning how to watch the waves themselves. And that subtle change alters the way you move through life. Situations that once felt overwhelming may now appear more manageable. Moments that once passed unnoticed may suddenly feel meaningful simply because you are more present while experiencing them. The interesting part is that this realization does not arrive as a final destination. It opens the door to an even deeper observation, because as you begin watching your reactions more closely, something else becomes visible. You start noticing the thoughts themselves, not just their content, but the way they appear, move, and fade inside your awareness. And this discovery introduces perhaps the most subtle shift of all. At a certain point in this process, something very subtle begins to happen. It is so quiet that many people almost overlook it at first. You start noticing your own thoughts. Not just the content of what you are thinking, but the act of thinking itself. Before this shift, thoughts usually felt inseparable from who you are. A thought appeared and almost instantly it became your perspective. If a worry entered your mind, it felt like a real problem that demanded your full attention. If a judgment appeared, it felt like an obvious conclusion about a situation or a person. There was very little distance between the thought and your sense of self. But gradually, something changes. A thought appears in your mind, and instead of immediately becoming absorbed in it, you notice it. You see it forming. For example, a small worry might arise about something that could happen later in the day. In the past, that worry might have immediately pulled your attention into a chain of imagined scenarios. One thought would lead to another, and soon your mind would be fully occupied with possibilities that had not even occurred. Now something different can happen. The thought still appears, but instead of being carried away by it, you recognize it as a thought. That simple recognition creates a small space. Inside that space, something important becomes visible. You begin to see that thoughts behave more like passing events than permanent truths. They arrive, stay for a moment, and then move on. Another thought appears, then another. Some feel important, others feel trivial. Some repeat themselves many times. Others vanish almost as quickly as they came. But the more closely you observe this process, the more a surprising realization begins to grow. You are not the thoughts themselves. You are the awareness that notices them. This distinction may sound simple, but experiencing it directly can change the way you relate to your entire inner world. Instead of believing every thought automatically, you begin to watch them with curiosity. You may notice how the mind often produces the same types of thoughts again and again. Old worries that revisit familiar scenarios. Judgments that form quickly based on past experiences. Predictions about the future that are built more from habit than from actual evidence. Seeing this pattern does not mean the mind stops producing those thoughts. The brain is designed to think. It constantly analyzes, predicts, remembers, and compares. That activity continues just as it always has. But when you can observe thoughts without immediately identifying with them, their influence changes. A critical thought about yourself may still appear, but now you see it as one mental event among many, rather than a final statement about who you are. An anxious prediction about the future may still arise, but you recognize it as the mind trying to anticipate possibilities, not as a guaranteed outcome. This shift introduces a quiet kind of freedom. Instead of being pushed around by every thought that appears, you begin choosing which ones deserve your attention. Some thoughts pass through without needing any response at all. Others are worth examining more carefully. The important part is that the automatic control those thoughts once had begins to weaken. And when that control weakens, your experience of life becomes less crowded. There is more space between one reaction and the next. More room for calm observation. More moments where you can simply experience what is happening without immediately interpreting it. This is why many people describe this stage as the beginning of real inner change. Not because life becomes perfect or because the mind suddenly becomes silent, but because awareness has taken a different position. You are no longer completely inside the stream of thought. You are able to watch the stream as it flows, and that ability transforms how you relate to yourself. Instead of fighting your thoughts or trying to eliminate them, you understand them. You see their patterns, their rhythms, their temporary nature. The mind continues doing what it has always done, but now it is being observed by something deeper and more stable. Once that space becomes noticeable, even in small moments, it quietly changes how you move through the world. Because when you can observe your thoughts instead of being controlled by them, a new possibility appears. You begin living with more awareness of each moment, and that awareness becomes the foundation for every other change that may follow. Real change in consciousness rarely arrives as a dramatic moment. Most of the time it begins quietly. It starts with small discomforts that make you question what once felt normal. Then you notice subtle shifts in how you see people, environments, and even your own thoughts. Little by little, awareness grows. Not as a new belief, but as a new way of observing your experience. And the most important part is this: once you begin noticing these things, something inside you has already started to move. You may not have all the answers yet. You may still feel like you are between two versions of yourself. But that space of observation is where real transformation begins. So if you stayed with me until this moment, write this sentence in the comments. I am learning to observe my mind. That will let me know you made it all the way to the end. And if this reflection resonated with you, take a moment to watch one of the videos appearing on your screen now. If you are exploring these shifts in awareness, the next video may help you see something even deeper.